Well, we got a dozen people on. Should we get started, Jeffrey? Guess I've known you since for the last 10 years or so, and I've really appreciated came out to Bittler's, a local place, a local farm with 160 cows on bedded pack, and you came out and gave them some advice, and there was a whole group of people there, and I was kind of impressed, and there's a lot of bedded pack in the area, and some of the cleanest cows I've seen have been on bedded pack, and some of the dirtiest ones are in compost pack. And the dirtiest ones, they thought they had a compost pack, but it was more of a wet straw manure pack. When the cows walked, it made like a sucking sound each time they lifted up their hooves. And they ended up putting some fans in, and it sort of helped, but the management was so bad there that that's kind of led me to trying to do stuff like this because it's a little tough when you're starting out so far behind the curve. Uh, I mean, it was just so wet, and the fans made it a lot better, but you got to till it and lots of other things. So yeah, I really appreciated you for coming out then, Jeffrey, and yeah, help people today. So I will
Great.
turn it over to you and see what we can all learn.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks for the opportunity, Kevin, to come speak today in this webinar about compost bedded pack barns. It's a topic that I've spent a lot of time over the last really almost 20 years now thinking about and working on. Um, my name's Jeffrey Bewley, and I'm the Executive Director of Innovation and Genetics at Holstein Association USA. So that's really not necessarily all that related to housing today. I've done a few things in my career working in extension and working for other players in the industry. And I've seen a lot of things in the dairy industry around the world over my career, and compost barns have been an important part of that. And I want to share with you some of the experiences of what we've learned in compost bedded pack barns. And I have a few hundred slides on this, so I've had to cut down a lot to be able to get down to the slot here, and I'm sure we'll still won't get everything covered, but I want to cover some key points here. So when I first heard about the idea of a compost bedded pack barn, I actually thought it really wasn't a very good idea because you bring animals in and you basically have them lay on their own manure in a sense. And I was concerned with that about how it might impact milk quality and animal well-being, and perhaps we'd have more mastitis. I really didn't like the concept when I first heard about it, but as we looked into it more, actually, we found what Kevin said, which is that when the system is managed well, the compost bedded pack barn can actually be a great environment for cows. So I want to share with you what we see that works and what doesn't work in the compost bedded pack barn. Before we get into that, I wanted to say that in general, in terms of housing systems, there's a lot of debate about whether the freestall barn is the best or the sand freestall barn, mattress freestall barn, compost bedded pack barn, tight stall barn, dry lots, etc. Which one's the best? Well, ultimately, there probably isn't a best per se. There's a best for you. There's a best for each individual manager, and which system is best is really a complicated decision. It's an ethical decision to some degree, it's a social decision, and it's definitely a business decision. My philosophy has always been in working with people on housing that my job has been more to help people understand what systems work where and why, and design those systems for that individual farm for what they want to do. It all ends up coming down to management. Every one of those systems we discussed can work very well when they're managed correctly. And some of the differences between systems vary depending on where we are. So the compost bedded pack barn in general, the concept is it's a loose housing system with a large open resting area, like you see in the pictures here and some of the other pictures that we've seen so far. It's not your grandfather's bedded pack barn. And that's a little bit of what Kevin alluded to earlier, is that I had that idea that at first it's just that you put bedding down and and the cows add their manure and you keep putting more bedding. Instead, what we're doing here is we're intensively managing a compost process. And that management helps to keep the cows dry and clean. So we're have cows that add their manure and urine to a organic bedding based. In general, that's sawdust or wood shavings. And then we till that or stir that twice a day to be able to manage that compost process. Well, in general, I would say that the risk for mismanagement of a compost bedded pack barn is higher than it is for stall-based barns. It's a little less forgiving of poor management or taking a break here and there. I think it requires more management than a stall-based barn. You have to pay more attention to things in a compost bedded pack barn, but probably a little bit less labor. You do have to take the time to go in and stir those pack, but that's on a tractor. It doesn't take very long. Less labor probably than managing individual stalls. And the system over the years has really exploded all around the world. I've had the opportunity to see these systems in some of the pictures here in Italy, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Brazil, in Malawi. Most recently, I was in Australia. There's a little bit of a housing movement there and had the opportunity to visit a lot of compost bedded pack barns in Australia last month. And really, it's working well there, just as it is in many other places. But the system's exploded all around the world. Now, what happens though is that we tend to see these movements where somebody decides in a particular area that compost bedded pack barns are what we're going to do in Australia or what we're going to do in Brazil or what we're going to do in California. And we kind of see the same process occur every time. Everyone says it's different here. We don't have to do it the way that you do it there. And from my perspective, I'm usually referring to there being Kentucky. That's where I live, Kentucky in the United States. So people kind of ignore some of the basic principles of compost bed and pack barn management that we're going to lay out today. Everyone thinks this is easy. It's an easy concept, but it's not that easy to actually make work. And when everybody starts breaking the rules, breaking the lessons that we've learned as an industry around the world, then it doesn't work as well as people anticipated. Everyone ends up a little bit disappointed. So in the end, what I would say is that, yes, there are definitely regional differences. There are differences between managing a compost bedded pack barn in Kentucky versus California versus Wisconsin versus Brazil versus Italy. But in the end, compost is compost and cows are cows. So some of the concepts apply across the board. So let's talk about what we learn. Why does working matter? Why does a compost bedded pack barn working optimally matter? Ultimately, it's because when the compost barn does not work well, we have higher incidence of clinical mastitis, we have a higher somatic cell count, and we have more hairy hill warts or digital dermatitis. So it does matter that we're providing that animal that dry resting surface. And this is what it looks like when it's dry. It really is amazingly dry and clean. This is a very common design that we see, particularly among smaller dairies. We have the large open resting area here with a feed bunk on one side. That feed bunk is generally concrete, and then some kind of a physical separation between the pack area and the feed alley with restriction from the water, generally speaking, from the pack side. And this is just another diagram looking at that. One of the most important factors, and we'll talk about it multiple times today, in the pack design is deciding how much or how large should this resting area be. You can go back and find some publications that suggest that perhaps it's 80 square feet per cow. We actually would now recommend 125 square feet per cow or about 12 square meters per cow of resting area only. The pack just works a lot better with more space per cow. Why would we even want to compost? Well, ultimately, the reasons we wouldn't want to compost is that when we're composting, it does reduce the amount of bedding that we have to use. So there is a cost savings there. We would clean the barn out less frequently. It reduces the total volume of material that we have to remove. It's more nutrient dense when we apply it to the land. It keeps more nitrogen when it's composting well. That nitrogen is a lot of value from a fertilizer perspective. And we end up with some odor reduction. The compost bedded pack barn that's managed well really doesn't have a lot of odor. And we can even have some fly reduction because this environment is not very conducive to fly larva growth. There are some real advantages to the compost bedded pack barn. One of them is rest choices. You can see cows in these pictures resting in many different positions. So they have a lot more opportunity to rest and lie down in different positions. Even we see some of this where we can see cows that are really in a deep sleep. So you see cows here with rapid eye movement, indicating they're in a deep sleep. And this sleep behavior, although it kind of looks strange at first, you think that this cow's not alive, but you see all these cows indeed are well and alive, probably has some behavioral benefits and perhaps even some immune function benefits. So I like to think about sleep in relation to our lives. And you can see here, there's a cow that's sleeping in an airplane seat versus a cow that's in a nice, comfortable mattress. And who gets the higher quality sleep in these two scenarios? It's probably the cow on the mattress, just like we get better sleep on the mattress than when we're in an airplane seat because we can't move around well. We can't change positions like we can with a loose housing or a loose bedding perspective. And I think sleep does matter. There's more research coming now on the importance of sleep in humans, but also in cows and other mammals. Sleep is very important biologically. So there are some likely immune function benefits, and we've actually been able to document that to some degree, indicating that there would be some sleep benefits for having better rest for cows. We also see more play and dominance behavior in compost bedded pack barns, and that's probably an advantage. The cows have a much smaller flight zone. I think a lot of that is because they have so much better footing that they can walk away easier. So the flight zones are pretty small in compost bedded pack barns. It's a lot easier for cows to lay down or rise from resting without all the restrictions associated with the freestall barn loop. So you watch cows go in and they walk into a compost barn and they decide to go down, lay down. It's really not a very long process. You don't see any kind of that hesitancy to lay down that you see in a freestall barn sometimes where they're trying to determine how to best do that without running into a loop. So that's really a nice feature of a compost bedded pack barn. Estrus detection is really easy in a compost bedded pack barn. They show estrus very well in a compost bedded pack barn. I think most of that comes down to, again, that better footing that they have in a compost bedded pack barn, not being on concrete. We do tend to see less lameness, and when we score that with locomotion scoring, we see fewer lame cows in compost bedded pack barns. And it works really well when we have multiple breeds within the same barn. So we have different sized animals, or maybe even different aged animals, first lactation cows versus older animals, because we don't have to worry about sizing stalls for different sized animals. They all fit fine within a compost bedded pack barn. There are probably even some advantages to the cooling of the udder that occurs when cows are laid out on their side like this. The bottom line is when the compost bedded pack barn is managed properly, it provides a dry resting surface that can really result in clean cows and clean udders. And that's really the ultimate driver of milk quality is keeping the cows clean. We do see some farms with their cows calving on compost bedded pack barns. I've not seen really any research on this, but I do have some questions about this in terms of what that does to the calf when that calf ends up first meal perhaps being some of this material that is composting. What does that do to to the calf itself. So it's still some questions I think here. There's always the question about whether or not we can feed from the pack. Do we need that concrete alley? Well, in Israel, actually, their system is primarily to not have that separate alley. The cows eat right off of the pack. But one big difference here is they have about 3 to 4 times the square footage or square meters of resting area in the compost bedded pack barn. That makes a big difference. And the climate in Israel tends to be more arid, which means it's easier for things to compost. The system can also work well for heifers, as you see in this picture. So when we think about the compost bedded pack barn, we think about the pros and cons. What are the benefits? Well, as I mentioned, I think the cow comfort can be really, really good in a compost bedded pack barn. Tends to be a little less expensive to build a compost bedded pack barn per cow than a freestall barn because you have less concrete, you have less loops and hardware within a compost bedded pack barn. We can get really good milk quality, and definitely one of the advantages is the manure handling aspect. It's a lot easier to handle manure from a compost bedded pack barn in a more compact form than in a freestall barn. What are the downsides? Biggest downside historically has been sawdust or shaving availability. We, in general, do need some kind of inorganic bedding source to be able to add to that compost bedded pack barn to give it some carbon. And ultimately, there's only so much sawdust and so much shavings that are out there, and there's a cost to that. There's a higher variable cost associated with the compost bedded pack barn compared to the freestall barn because you use more bedding. So that has to be factored into the decision-making process. As I mentioned earlier, it does likely require a bit more management ability. It tends to be a system that doesn't work well with retrofits. And the building footprint can be pretty big here because we're talking about so much space per cow, ultimately 3 times, perhaps even 4 times the space per cow in a compost barn than what we would have for a freestall barn. And so it just takes up a lot of space, but also there's a cost to that square footage also. Now, early on, when we started working with compost barns, a lot of people said that there was the reason the compost bedded pack barns worked was because the heating process of the compost killed off the bacteria that killed mastitis. And we did quite a bit of work on this and determined that that's definitely not the case. In fact, mastitis pathogens really thrive in optimal composting conditions. So it's not that we're killing bacteria that cause mastitis. I think it's really important to understand that. But instead, I think it's about providing that cow that dry, comfortable place to lay down. And a lot of our questions initially about compost bedded pack barn, like I said, we're focused on somatic cell count and mastitis management. So one of the things we did early on was we did a study on 15 farms where we had 8 compost bedded pack barns and 7 freestall barns that were all on DHI. And these were all good managers of freestall barns or good managers of compost barns. And we looked at a lot of different things in that study. You can read this study at EcoCamp et al., but I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but just to say that some of the things that we found, hygiene score, no difference between the two systems. The cows were equally clean in the compost barn as they were the sand freestall barn. High somatic cell count, the percentage of cows with a somatic cell count over 200,000. No significant difference between those two systems. The clinical mastitis incidents, there was no significant difference between the two farms. We did see a little bit of a difference in the mastitis pathogens that occurred with the compost bedded pack barn. So in the compost bedded pack barn, a higher percentage of the cases were caused by E. coli, whereas in the sand freestall barn, a higher percentage of the cases were caused by environmental streps. Interestingly, where we might have thought we had a problem with Klebsiella, you can actually see numerically even a little bit higher incidence of Klebsiella in the sand freestall barn, but both really low, really no difference there. Bottom line is we were able to see clinical mastitis really working just as well in a compost bedded pack barn as a sand freestyle barn. Now, it's important to remember these were well managed compost bedded pack barns. Not every compost bedded pack barn is well managed. And when they're not managed, we can see real disaster. So here's an example of a barn that had a major prototheca outbreak, partly because they had water staining that was working its way into the pack. But in addition to that, they had their sawdust stored outside, and there would be water that would pull around that. And then they moved this water and sawdust into the pack, and we saw a major prototheca outbreak in this herd. So we definitely can get and have mastitis outbreaks of significant concern when things are not managed well in a compost bedded pack barn. Really important to understand that moisture of the pack itself has a huge impact on how clean those cows are. So this just graph just shows in that study looking at the hygiene score of the cows compared to the moisture content. As the pack gets wetter, the cows are dirtier. Kind of common sense, but it's nice to see that quantified there. And here's another study actually out of Brazil, showing similar things. They took it to another level, showing that as moisture increases, so does the environmental clinical mastitis, overall clinical mastitis incidence rate, subclinical mastitis incidence rate. All these increased as the cows got dirtier. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk a bit more about how we manage and how we build a compost bedded pack barn. There are four real keys to managing a compost bedded pack barn. First is the facility design. We need to design the facility in the best way to optimize composting. Part of that is adequate ventilation. Ventilation is really critical for composting because we're relying on evaporation to make this system work. We need to make sure we manage our stocking density, or how many square feet or meters those animals have in the rest space, and then we need to stir it frequently. We need to stir those packs twice a day, 365 days a year. And ultimately, when I think about it, I think there's a lot of different balls that we can juggle to get to the same endpoint. Our endpoint is to get to that optimal moisture range, which is in the 45 to 55% moisture range. We can move different levers, if you will, to get to the same point. So if we have fewer cows per square area, then we can get by with using less bedding, or we can get by with poor ventilation. If we have more cows in the space, then we need even more bedding, or we need even more ventilation or more stirring. So we can look at that and say there's different ways we can do that. So like, for example, I have some friends that have free bedding. They get all their bedding for free. They can get by with stocking rates a little bit higher and maybe a design of a barn that's not quite as ideal, simply because they just make up for it by using more bedding. And that works. All of these different levers can be pulled to get to that same end goal. How do we manage a compost barn? We're generally going to start with 1.5 to 2 feet of bedding to begin a new compost bedded pack barn. And that can take a lot of sawdust in the beginning. We're generally adding new bedding when the old bedding starts looking moist. There's some other ways we can look at that. We'll talk about that in a minute. We're adding new bedding depending on the conditions outside. It may be every 1 to 8 weeks. That's a wide range. In the wintertime, that may even be twice a week when it's humid or when it's wet. In the summertime, we might go the entire summer without having to add new bedding. And in general, we're cleaning these packs out once or twice a year, most of the time once a year. Lots of questions about bedding. Bedding is generally needed to help add carbon and absorb some of the moisture that occurs from the addition of manure and urine. Sawdust and shavings, as I mentioned, are gold standards. Ideally, we'd like a moderate particle size. In theory, ground up straw, corn cobs, and soy stubble would work, but none of those are exactly easy to get either. Rice hulls can add porosity, but they don't have a lot of carbon and they don't have a lot of moisture absorption capacity. Almond shells seem to work pretty well, but they don't have as high of a carbon to nitrogen ratio, so that might mean you need more of them to make the pack work. And in different parts of the world, we've seen other things applied well. So here's some example of almond shells at a compost bedded pack barn in California. This was actually working quite well. Now, one of the things that we encourage people to do is think about a way to stockpile bedding. Bedding availability tends to be somewhat seasonal, and it's nice to have some stored bedding in those scenarios. A lot of times they get calls and say, my compost barn's not working. What do I do? And here's an example of one of those calls from a few years ago. Really a wet, chunky compost bedded pack barn. They said the barn wasn't working. I said, what should I do? And I said, add a semi-load of sawdust to the barn. And they did that, and you can see within a few days it was working great again. So the quick fix is just put more bedding in there. Now that only works if other conditions are correct, but it definitely can work. We get lots of questions about what to stir with, and we've seen all kinds of different things used to stir. This simple kind of tined equipment can work very well. Ideally, if we're going to do that, we'd add these shovels or sweeps to the end that will increase our mixing ability. So that's something we like to see in those kinds of equipment. The rototiller really can help break up clumps and make for a nice uniform material, as you see in the pictures here. The challenge with a conventional rototiller is they tend not to get deep enough. Again, here you see that very, very uniform bedding material. What we really like to see is this kind of equipment. This is designed specifically for compost bedded pack barns. It gets deep and it has a rototiller. So you're getting both actions there. This is the ideal type of equipment for compost bedded pack barns. And again, I've seen systems like this all around the world, just different brands that people have taken the same concept. And one of the myths that I like to talk about with compost bedded pack barns is that people say my compost barn's working. I know it's working because I saw it steam this morning. Steam is a good sign, but it's not necessarily a sign that we're getting compost action. All it means is that the pack area is warmer than the ambient conditions. So if it's 20 degrees outside and my pack is 70 degrees, I'm probably going to see steam, but 70 degrees is not composting. So it's a good sign, but we need to dig a little bit deeper to understand whether or not our compost barn is actually working. It can really help if we set these barns up in ways that we can stir in multiple directions or in circles. It helps to increase the air infiltration and can really break up some of the clumps of material. We want to be careful not to design the barn with so many posts that, like you see in this one, it makes it really hard to stir that kind of a pack. We have to be careful with the equipment that we use. Heavy equipment, they can actually compact behind where we've done. So you see here where we've compacted with driving across this material. And ultimately what that means is this area doesn't have oxygen getting to it. And we need oxygen to be able to provide that optimal environment for composting. Composting is an aerobic process. So how do we determine whether or not it's working? Here's some management checks that we can do. Temperature is a great indicator of whether or not the compost barn is working. And we'd like to see that temperature somewhere in the 110 to 150 degree Fahrenheit range, or just hot enough you don't want to touch it. Now, that's not the temperature on the surface, by the way. That's a temperature about 8 to 12 inches deep. So if you go into a compost barn, you kick into there 8 to 12 inches deep, or you go in with a probe to go in 8 to 10 inches deep, that gives you an indication of the temperature. We'd really like to see it in that temperature range. Moisture is a leading indicator. Moisture would be better if we could measure that. We can't measure it as easily, unfortunately. People talk about using soil probes. Unfortunately, the soil probes are designed for a specific density, and soil probes don't give you an accurate measure of moisture in a compost bedded pack barn. You could take this and put it into a Koster tester or even a dehydrator or something to really calculate the moisture. But ultimately, the easy way to look at the moisture is to do this ball test. that you can see in the image here, where we take a ball of material, and what we'd like to do is we want to be able to form a ball, but when I toss that ball up, it breaks apart pretty easily. If it stays together, it's too wet. If we can squeeze water out of it, it's way too wet. And then if it just doesn't even form a ball, it's actually too dry. Now, maybe that doesn't matter if it's too dry. It probably doesn't, because our goal is to provide the cow a place to lay down, not to necessarily manage a compost. So I don't worry too much if it's too dry. That little simple test works really, really well. Um, we can also look at fluffiness, which is basically just how much give is there as we walk across that. We could look at the distribution of cows in the barn. We can look at dirty cows. That's not the right thing to do, because that's a lagging indicator. Or we could look at somatic cell count or clinical mastitis as our sign that the pack's not working. But again, that's even more of a lagging indicator that we've let it go and it's not working the way we'd like for it to work. Here's some pictures of compost at different temperatures. You can see these top two. We've got the ideal type of material working in terms of composting, and we've got temperatures in that 130 plus range. This one here at the bottom is still warm, it's still 99 degrees, but you can see that material clumping together. You can see the moisture there. This is too wet. This isn't really composting. And the one on the right, bottom right, is actually too dry. But again, I'm not so worried about that. This is what the compost looks like when it's working well. It's dry, it's fluffy, really, really comfortable for these cows. And this is what it looks like when it's not working. It's wet, there's clumps of material, there's a lack of uniformity. What do we think about when we think about design of the barn? First of all, we want to select the right site to put it. We want to select a site that maximizes ventilation, particularly summer winds. I always say, remember that natural ventilation is free. So we want to take advantage of it first before we start thinking about mechanical ventilation, which also is important. We want it to be slightly elevated. In general, in most parts of the world, we can get by with a clay base. We don't necessarily need concrete, but make sure and check with your local conservation specialist for that, because some states in the US and some countries require a concrete base. A lot of times we're just using a modified freestall barn, and we need to make sure that we account for feed and water space. That's one thing, unfortunately, that we've seen over and over again is the barn is designed right for composting, but there's not enough space for the cows to eat, or not enough water space, and then we have other performance limiting factors to consider. In the end, as we studied this more, we said really we should think about managing the system in the compost in the summer versus the winter time. It's completely different. It's really easy to manage these systems in the summertime, and unfortunately, it can be really hard to manage these systems in the winter time. Build the barn with consideration for the maximum number of cows that you'll be milking, not your average number of cows. Make sure you consider milk production and cow size. Cows that milk more, larger cows are going to require more space because they have more manure and urine output. Make sure we start thinking about feed and water early in the design process. And remember that the pack has to be stirred twice a day, every day, no exceptions. There's no days we can skip stirring. And we've also changed our recommendation for a retaining wall. A lot of the early recommendations were to have a 4-foot retaining wall. We've actually changed that to 2.5 foot retaining wall. Yes, you reduce the amount of manure storage, but the problem with that really high retaining wall is that when a cow's lying beside that, there's no airflow to that cow. The system is just absolutely unforgiving to overstocking. You see both these pictures here are of an overstocked barn. Providing less than 100 square feet per cow is a recipe for disappointment. It's just too much moisture and urine that's deposited on the pack to overcome. When we design these barns, we'd like to see these open ridges with high sidewalls. This provides us with the opportunity for maximum natural ventilation. High sidewalls maximize cross ventilation, and we'd like to keep at least 14 foot of opening between the top of the retaining wall and the bottom of the eave. The orientation of the barn is really critical. And I can't emphasize this enough. East-west orientation is the only way to really build a compost barn effectively. And you can see in the videos here, these videos were actually put together by Flavio Damasceno from Brazil. Um, when we have an east-west orientation, we're minimizing the amount of time when the sun is really blaring down on the cows. When we go with a north-south orientation, there's a part of the day when both sides of that barn are negatively impacted by the sun during the summertime. And what happens is cows will move away from the sun in the summertime and they will bunch. They will bunch and really limit how much of that barn that they use. And ultimately, that has a huge negative impact on their performance, on how they're affected by heat stress, and it makes the pack work a lot worse. This concrete retaining wall helps to provide a separation between the feed alley and the pack area. It's helpful for managing pack moisture. It can help keep bedding within the barn. These high retaining walls, like I said, they block air. So that's why we've moved that to a 2.5 foot retaining wall instead of 4. We really want to have wider alleys in the compost bedded pack barn than what we would typically have in a freestyle barn, because we generally have our water space adjacent to the freestall feed alley. Sorry, not freestall, but just the feed alley. And we need to be able to provide an opportunity for one cow to stand eating, one cow to walk through, and another cow to drink at the same time. And that's what we need. We need that 14 to 16 foot feed alley for that to be able to happen. The eave overhangs are also really important. They help minimize the impact of weather. They limit the amount of wind and precipitation and sunlight that enter the barn. And these overhangs, the size of those should be about 1/3 of the eave height. And we see a lot of challenges where people shortchange these eave overhangs. A lot of the barns in Australia that I saw recently, this was one of their challenges. Fans can really be a huge help in compost bedded pack barn. First of all, fans properly positioned will help cool the cows, but they also help dry the bedding, so they can actually be beneficial for the compost process itself. The challenge is when we don't have enough fans, the cows tell us. Here's a barn that the cows are telling us. You can see they're right lined up against those fans. They really needed more fans in this barn, and the cows are saying we needed more. It takes about 3 to 4 times the fan coverage in a compost barn than it does a freestyle barn. Ultimately, this is probably one of the biggest disadvantages of a compost barn. Because in a freestyle barn, we're not worried about cooling them in the alleys, and we have a lot less space per cow. When enough fans are included, perhaps some of the economic benefits are diminished for a compost barn. But this is a huge issue that we see in the field now. And so we can think about these panel or box fans. For spacing them, we want to think about 10 times the blade diameter or 6 to 8 feet between fans. And we have to think about the side-by-side spacing of these fans also. So this is really not that large of a barn here, but you can see we have 4 rows of 5 fans, so 20 panel fans to cover that whole area. So ultimately what that's meant is a lot of people have moved to the high volume, low speed fans in compost bedded pack barns. They do a great job of distributing a lot of air across an area. They do not do as good of a job in cooling the cow. They'll only get to maybe 3 miles an hour maximum with airspeed, so they don't cool as well, but they certainly dry as well. And when you look at this from an overall systems perspective, we have the same size barn there. We only have 5 of these in this particular barn. So it's a lot less fans, a lot less motors, a lot less maintenance. Maybe we don't cool the cows quite as well, but the expense of this is a major factor. Now, we do have to space these right. And our general thought process is that spacing should be 2 to 2.5 times the diameter of the fan between fans. And typically what we've seen is a lot of 3 or 4 times the diameter. And you end up with dead spots. You end up with spots in between the fans where the cows will not go. And then we have some of those problems we talked about earlier. Just more pictures of this bunching behavior. This is a big problem that we see in compost barns that are not designed correctly. As I mentioned, light moves cows, so this is a north-south oriented barn, and you can see the cows are avoiding using that area there. Curtains can definitely help in the wintertime. In some environments, curtains are absolutely essential. We don't have to have curtains in Kentucky. Most of our barns actually don't have curtains, but as you go further north and you go into colder areas around the world, curtains can really help a lot. We want to make sure that cows cannot access feed or water from the pack because you end up with a big messy area around those waters. So we really want to avoid those scenarios. Typically, then what people are doing is some kind of a restriction of access. Early on, we saw a lot of concrete walls. Concrete walls probably aren't essential. You can see here, this barn, they just have some wood there that works just as well. Just something to keep the cows from accessing the water from the opposite side, from the pack side. We have to be careful with wide entrances on the short end of the barn. They tend to get wet and we lose effective space. Typically, then, to avoid that, what we would recommend is multiple narrow entrances along the long side of the barn. About every 50 feet, we would have our entrances, as you can see in the picture here. What do we need to think about beyond the design itself for managing mastitis risk? Not all mastitis comes from the cow's environment or how clean the cow is. It's important also to think about parlor hygiene and milking procedures, to focus on the teat ends when you're cleaning in the milking parlor. I'm a huge proponent of the J5 vaccines in compost bedded pack barn farms, possibly even the Klebsiella vaccine. Not as clear on that one. One of the things that we've seen very clearly is peroxide pre-dips do not work well in compost barns at all. So we'd like to avoid peroxide pre-dips. I think there's just too much organic load for peroxide to be able to handle. And then we always want to think about things like genetic selection for mastitis risk and nutrition and immunity's role in managing mastitis also. So why don't all compost barns work? We do see plenty that don't work. The reasons are barn design flaws, stocking density. I would say 8 times out of 10, maybe even 9 times out of 10, when I get pictures or I get calls about compost barns not working, it's because of overstocking. As I mentioned earlier, the system is unforgiving of overstocking. The material that's used in the pack, you can see some straw here. In theory, straw should work. Straw does compost, of course, but I think it just doesn't compost fast enough unless it were really broken down, really short particles to be able to work in compost barns. Cedar doesn't work well in compost barns. Cedar has antimicrobial properties, so the bacteria that we need don't grow well. I see challenges with stirring frequency or stirring depth. Usually frequency is the bigger problem. People that break that rule of stirring twice a day, every day, just not doing a good job in the stirring process. One of the things we learned over and over again, it's really hard to start a pack in the wintertime. There's just such a temperature gradient that's needed to move that pack to the temperature that it needs to be at. If it's working going in the wintertime, it doesn't seem to be a problem. There are, of course, limits and questions still remaining about compost bedded pack barns. One of them is just bedding availability and the cost of the bedding, the management level that we talked about. I think there's a scalability concern here. It's a lot easier to get the bedding and everything that you need to make a compost barn work if you're milking 50 cows or 150 or maybe even 300 cows. When you start milking 1,500 cows, 5,000 cows, 10,000 cows, it's a lot of bedding required there. So there are some scalability questions here. There's some questions about heat tolerant or heat loving bacteria, thermoduric and thermophilic bacteria. That's really probably not much of a concern when managed correctly, but there have been issues with some milk quality problems, not in the typical sense, but some other challenges that can occur. We won't get into a lot of depth on that, but we've measured that here in our system in the US and didn't see any problems here. And then you get into the sustainability discussion. Is the compost barn better from a sustainability perspective or worse? And if we look at that objectively and you look at the literature on emissions from a compost bedded pack barn, there are some things it's probably better for and other things it's probably worse for compared to a freestall barn. So that's not really clear cut whether it's better or worse. So we were able to get through all the slides, which I'm happy about. Um, I think we can stop now and take any questions. And as you move forward, if you have other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Yeah, if you've got anybody on here, if you've got a question, raise your hand and I will unmute you. The If you can see the chat, Jeffrey, I put in all the questions that came in that people ask on ahead of time. And one of them was what's a what what would be a good an idea of the recommended lying times for cows? That I believe on compost pack. Would that be the same as any other thing? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, with line times, we talk about that ideal line time of around 12 hours a day for a cow, and I don't think we would expect that recommendation needs to change. I will say that we have measured that, and the cows do tend to lay down more in the compost barns than in a freestall barn. I do get concerned when cows actually go too high. So if you've got a cow lying down 14, 15 hours a day, she's either lame or not milking very much. It's really hard to lay down 14, 15 hours a day and eat enough to be able to support a high level of production. So I think we need to be thinking about line time all the time. It's extremely important, but there's probably a point where we can actually have cows that are too lazy and lay down too much.
Okay. Like if you have a robot barn, you have to go chase them in. Those are always the low producing
Yes.
ones.
Yeah.
They're also asking the cheaper or innovative ways to cover the compost other than building a new barn. Ooh.
Well, I mean, we're talking about a facility specifically for this, so I'm not sure exactly what that question's asking, but you can have a compost and just compost manure outside of a barn if you want, but it's just a different concept than this.
This is composting the manure while your animal is living, while the cows are living in it. And
Right.
you're trying to manage it in such a way that the compost is ideal bedding material.
Right.
Okay, another question. John Tyson's wondering, space per cow. You are still looking for 100 square foot as a minimum. I think in there you alluded to up to 125 to 150.
Yeah, so I think 100 is the minimum, but I if I'm designing a barn, I'd like it in the 125 to 150 range. I think if you start at 100, you're going to eventually have a problem. Ultimately, everybody's always trying to squeeze a few more cows in, and that there's good reasons for that, but the compost barn is just not forgiving of that. And I'll also say it just makes your life way easier when you're in that 125 to 150 square feet range. If you're at 100 square feet, and that's why I say it's the minimum, you're always pushing up against the limit of whether or not it's working or not. But when you get into that 125, 150 range, it just works better, and you use a lot less bedding also.
Hmm. I think of it as in plywood. I'm not sure why, but I think of it in plywood sheet increments. Like when I'm imagining 100 square foot, three plywood sheets would be like 90, 96. Four plywood sheets would be, um, yeah, you're 125 or so. So it'd be the equivalent of four sheets of plywood laid out on the ground is what your cow takes. Uh,
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it.
I'm not sure why I would just look at it that way. Uh, the other one, any good resource standards for design considerations, ventilation, slope, roof slope, that's that kind of thing. Yeah, you did a bunch of it.
Yeah, we have a publication that's out there on that. I'm happy to share that if somebody wants to email me. It should be still on the internet.
Okay. And the other one is Wisconsin has the University of Wisconsin has some really nice what's it called? I can send that out to the attendees as well. Uh, really nice and basic cow design, barn design. Wisconsin University.
Yeah,
Uh,
the Dairyland Initiative website's great.
yeah, that's what it is. Dairyland Initiative.
And don't forget about your neighbors there, Penn State.
Oh yeah, yeah. Penn State. They're right here. Uh, we've got one question here. I'm not sure. How do engineers gain the know-how and experience to help dairy farmers design and advise them? I said you're going to have to go out and meet a bunch of them and read everything you can. Where would you suggest, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I mean, so the one document, I'll share that with you. You can share it with the attendees. I'll share it with you after the meeting, but we really tried to incorporate everything into that one document that we understood about compost barns. So that I think that gives a great start. But we're always all learning, right? So we're always learning, and the best thing you can do is visit farms and see what works and what doesn't work. We that was the first thing we did in our project was we visited about 45 barns and collected a lot of data from that. And that taught us as much as anything, learning from the things that were working and not working on farms, learning from the farms that were doing it.
Yeah, that's what I would think. And here, the next question is how to encourage more people to use this practice for manure management. Do you encourage people to do it, or if they want to do it, you help them do it better?
I've never thought that I should be as telling somebody how to manage, how to build one, whether they should build one barn or another. I think that's a personal decision. It's and a little bit of it's like, do I drive a Chevy truck, a Ford truck, or a Dodge truck? Well, we all have different opinions and we have personal preferences, and I don't I've never thought I should try to convince more people to do compost barns. If that's what they want to do, then let's help them figure out how to make it work. If they want to build a freestyle barn, let's help them figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that one. The next question, basically, uh, how does the product compare to cleaning out a bedded pack in terms of ability to safely apply to vegetable fields? Well, isn't there some specification in what vegetable fields? Because I remember somebody in Mexico, some vegetable buyer was fussing down in Mexico. They were irrigating with sewage because that was the cheapest water you could get, and it had nutrients in.
Yeah, there are nutrients there. I'm not an expert on that at all. I don't know a lot about vegetable raising and the requirements there. I know there's a high nutrient value to the material, and in that publication, we've got some nutrient analysis so they can see what those numbers are. Um, but it's best to talk to somebody that's an expert in nutrient management and soils to be able to figure out how to best use that facility, use that
Yeah,
material. I know in the fields like for putting it on cornfields or hay fields or whatever, it is an outstanding material to be able to improve crop yields. But vegetables, I think, would have some different requirements there.
they may require and here's some pure speculation, but I'm guessing vegetables would require composted. But while this is compost, there's still going to be a chance of fresh manure along with it.
There is, and I would say that compared to say putting compost in a windrow, this is not fully composted. It's always composting, but the difference between this and putting it in a windrow is that we're always adding manure and urine to it. So it's constantly changing. It's much more dynamic. And ultimately what that means is it never reaches that full completion of a compost that you would see like in a windrow. We actually don't get to that 180 plus degrees. We'll never get there in a compost barn, but in a windrow you will. And that's like if you look at organic requirements, it has to meet that requirement to be able to be used. So it's a little different material. So if you're talking about organic and vegetables, I think it's best to talk to somebody um, who knows more about that to make sure you're not breaking any rules there.
Yeah. Again, Jessica Miller from North Carolina is asking, how do we get the pack initially started composting? And I think you alluded to it. It's easier in the summertime, which means that Mother Nature helps.
It does. I don't. It's really hard to get them started in the wintertime. This time of the year is a great time to start it. Going into the spring, into the summer, even early fall can be fine. One of the things that we see people make mistakes on a lot in a new barn is not putting enough bedding in to begin with. And it really does take that 1.5 to 2 foot of bedding to get it started. The other thing is people expect it to work immediately, but we have to build a population of bacteria to be able to get there. So it takes 3 to 4 weeks before it really starts composting. It's not going to happen overnight.
I remember the Bittlers talking about trying to start up in the winter time, and they just couldn't get it hot enough, and they were tilling and tilling, and eventually I think they kind of, oh, what did they do? They kind of just slogged through using lots and lots of bedding until the weather warmed up and they were able to get it, the tilling, to get it start heating on its own. And
Yeah.
it was a kind of an expensive problem in a way.
It's a real challenge to start them in the wintertime.
But that's when they were start. I mean, that's when the project was done, and that's when the cows came. So, what are you going to do?
You can use a lot of bedding. That's about the only thing you can do.
What's a maximum length of keeping dairy cows in compost pack? I'll answer that. The show when I get around with my ventilation controllers service work, I've noticed the show cows often are on bedded or compost packed. So that I believe means they last longer, or people on average assume they're not going to get beat up as quick.
Yeah, a lot of times people say the cows in a compost barn they'll get another lactation out of a cow, but there's no limit to how long the cow can be on a compost barn.
Uh, Somebody's asking, does compost bedded pack need tillage regularly? And that's of course. Recommended bedding, straw, sawdust, wood shavings. You kind of went over that. Fine sawdust is the easiest. Straw, you probably can if you grind it to powder.
It would have to be ground pretty well, pretty short to work.
There was other people asking about alternatives, and I think you kind of availability of bedding is where the bedded pack barns go. Is that correct?
It's a problem. Availability of bedding is one of the biggest limits. Um, there are there are some alternatives that have worked in different parts of the world, but there aren't many. There aren't many. I'm always searching for something new, but I've not run across much. And like coffee hulls work in Brazil. We don't grow a lot of coffee in Kentucky, so that doesn't help me much. But it depends a lot on what's available locally.
What about ground? We have a lot of corn fodder in this area, or soybean. If you grind that, does that work?
Soy stubble probably would work. Corn fodder would not. It doesn't have enough moisture absorption capacity.
Mm. Angie Wilson just asked, if the pack is fluffy and dry and the cows are clean and the milk quality is good, do we still need to be getting such high temperatures?
I wouldn't worry about it much. I mean, ultimately, again, in the end, we're not necessarily trying to manage a compost process. We're trying to have healthy, clean cows. And if you're able to achieve those objectives, I'd say don't worry about it.
Uh, Somebody, a square foot of animal unit per bedded area. Oh, animal unit. Well, it's going to be just go per cow. How can the compost petted pack be used? Field application, covered pile, covered or uncovered? If you would dump it out in a pile and cover it, would it keep composting?
It would. Eventually, though, you'd have to add some oxygen to it. If you're not going to add oxygen to it, that will stop eventually.
Jacob from Maryland is asking about the cost difference breakdown between composted bedded pack versus liquid manure storage. I do you ever
That's a
actually do anything of that sort?
that's a pretty complicated question. I mean, that would require some significant spreadsheet development. It's a great question, but I don't have a good answer for it.
It would depend on your size, I think. Like a smaller farm, the compost pack is a single. You have the barn, and whereas as you get larger, the barn would be too big for the amount of cows.
There's a lot that goes into that.
Somebody asked about the pros and cons, but we kind of went over. You did go over that. It's kind of bedding source for and larger barn versus, yeah, the other trade-offs.
I think the only other question I see here that's different is about the beef barn, and the concept is the same for sure. And um, you probably don't need as much space for a beef animal because they don't eat as much, so they don't have as much manure and urine output. But it's not just divided by the size of the cow because there's still a compaction issue that occurs there. So they do need it will work for beef though, and we see more of that now.
Yeah, okay, yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of it with our big fans. I'm definitely seeing more of them going into beef barns and them trying it. Yeah, you're right. The only other question is square foot per lactating animal, which we did do. Somebody's asking about door widths. Well, you're just gonna have to make them big enough to get in there and spin around with a tractor. I remember the gentleman that had to clean his cows. He had an older crawler and just a regular 3-point chisel plow. It was nothing fancy, but he went in there and he tilled it, and he actually drove pretty fast because he said it threw it around more, and he had really clean cows. They were spotless. What else here? Sawdust alternatives in
Yeah,
Canada. Hmm. I don't know what grows cheap in Canada.
well, they do have some peat moss that can work. I think Tom Wright was asking that. Tom's done some research on that too.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody before we wrap this up? I wrote, let me turn to my camera.
Kevin,
Here.
I've got another meeting that I've got to
Yep.
hop to.
Okay. Hey, well, I appreciate your time, and I'll just finish up real quick here.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Take care, Jeffrey. Appreciate it. So I just wrote a little, if any of you are interested that are on here, I just wrote a little book about where big fans work because I build fans and ventilation controllers for a living, and I've got a desk in the corner of our shop, so it's nothing real high. How should I say it? I don't. I have a corner office in the corner of the shop, and I just got done writing this little book on how fans work. So if you email us or put your name in the chat, we can send you a physical copy as long as you're in the United States here because we got it. You can get it on Amazon, and we can just get one sent to you. So I really appreciate you all watching, and we'll send out a recording of this for everyone.